it up for questions and see if we can't get a good dialogue going here. I think we got a microphone here. Anybody want to? Come on, I know there's some student journalists here, right? Let's have some tough questions. Oh, I don't know how to turn that on. Yeah. No?
I'll just speak.
Okay.
Could you explain or your kind of opinion towards where Russia's going in its relationship with Belarus and Lukashenko? If you describe it in such terms like this, do you see it more kind of being a contrasting relationship, or are they becoming more comparable?
It's a good question. The question for those who didn't hear the beginning of it is the relationship with Belarus right now. Belarus, of course, used to be part of the Soviet Union. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's under the control of a man named Alexander Lukashenko, who was a very tight-fisted dictator, a genuine dictator, much more so than Putin. In Lukashenko's Belarus, there's not even the illusion of an open society. It's a very, very constricted political space. And I think that I don't think that Russia is going in the direction of Belarus necessarily. I think that's in the extreme, that it could eventually do that. But I think Putin has the idea that he is a westernizer in some way, that he has this sort of Peter the Great interest of being the man who opened Russia to the West. And so they want to have this illusion of democracy. They want to have more, at least, the idea of an open society. They don't want to be thought of as Belarus, because Belarus is a pariah state. But more and more they show, an inclination and a willingness to do things that will get them put into that category. There's a meeting of the world's democracies that was organized recently, and they disinvited Russia. Leaving it in the camp of the countries like Belarus and Zimbabwe and others that are not considered to be democracies anymore. Freedom House, which is a non-governmental organization that promotes freedom around the world, changed its rating about a year or so ago of Russia from partially free to not free. Again, on some level, this is an exaggeration. It's not, a totalitarian state. It's not a place like Belarus or Turkmenistan, or Zimbabwe or the old Soviet Union, where you have absolutely no freedoms. You do have freedoms there. But you don't if you do anything that is perceived as a challenge to the state or as a challenge to the Kremlin. Now, in terms of relationship, there's obviously tension, by the way, for those who care about it. There's obviously tension now between the two. It used to be that, Belarus was sort of a nice, friendly, puppet, in effect, almost, of Russia, and that's clearly changed. The fight over gas recently indicates that the Kremlin's gotten tired of Lukashenko and believes that he is exploiting them and their beneficence, I think, and they've decided to sort of like crack the whip on him a little bit. The source of that, I'm not 100% sure, but I bet your money is really what's underlying that tension.
You were talking earlier about all the alcoholism problems in America, or I guess in Russia. Comparatively to America, how is Russia addressing these problems as far as drug addiction and alcoholism?
Well, they do address it, but not in the kind of aggressive way that, America has over the years. For instance, at one point, Duma wanted to make beer an alcoholic beverage. And the vodka and the beer industry said, no, we don't want to do that. And so it was not. Beer is not an alcoholic beverage in Russia. Kids walk down the street with open bottles of beer the way they do here with Coke or Pepsi. It's sort of jarring, I think, to the American, eye when you walk into a Moscow, subway and find, 16-year-olds with open beer. Vodka is sold in a can. at street kiosks. There's a joke that the bottles of vodka in Russia are never actually sold with resealable caps, because what would be the point? So there's a whole cultural phenomenon in Russia that has never genuinely addressed it. It's because it's politically dangerous to. The last leader who tried was Gorbachev, who had a very tough anti-alcohol campaign and paid a political price for it. So, it's a real conundrum for the society that is yet to really be addressed in an open and powerful way. Yeah. You want to stand there, or?
My question is twofold. You talked about today Russia, most of the proponents of democracy are kind of prosecuted. But at the same time, if you make a poll on Russian population, you will see that the most of the population support the government's policy and will feel more secure than in the days ago from the social and economic point. Do you think in this situation that forced introduction of principles of democracy to conflict will be a good solution? And the second part of my question, if let's imagine that the next deal at the end of this year, the government of Russia will come a new guy who is pro-Western and support more democratic principles. And in this case, we saw from the recent history in Ukraine in this republic that the government change, radical government change, didn't bring any positive consequences to the population. And most of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union population don't want this kind of radical change. And what do you think about it?
Sure. Okay. The question, for those who couldn't hear it, is really it really boils down to the idea: do Russians want radical change? Do they, in fact, want these so-called Democrats and so forth? And it's a very good question. The people who are, I say so-called Democrats, because some of them are frauds and fakes, just like politicians everywhere, and I don't want to give them too much moral authority, but the people who advocate a more Western-style democracy in Russia are, in fact, marginalized in Russian society for a couple of reasons. One is many of them are associated with the 90s. People like Grigory Yavlinsky, Boris Nemtsov. These are figures who, to the public, remind them of a period that they didn't much like. That when they lost their life savings, when the economy was in turmoil, when people were, again, had the tanks in the streets. So they are not popular figures. And there has not been a new generation, really, of democracy activists or leaders to replace them, to speak for the principles without the baggage of the 1990s. Kasparov is trying, and he comes with a certain popular image in the sense that he was, the world chess champion, and he was not part of the mistakes of the Yeltsin era. So he has a clean, pedigree in that regard. But it's still a marginal figure at this point. It's a good question, though. There's a certain chicken-egg quality to this. Putin is popular in the polls. 70% or so say they support him. He did win re-election in 2004 with, I think 72% of the vote, and that's probably a reflection, more or less, of where the Russian public is. But if the Russian public never gets to see a genuine alternative, if the space is not really genuinely open to debate and to accountability for government, is it really a surprise then that the existing power has a certain popularity? If state television shows every night Putin doing something heroic and great, and doesn't show the opposition, or only shows the opposition in a negative light, it's no surprise to me that 70% say that they would want Putin. Having said that, I don't want to diminish the fact that the public does support Putin to some extent. Democracy is not their top concern, according to many polls. Stability, economic growth, a manageable life. these are sometimes described as top priorities, and Putin has tapped into the popular will in the sense that he exploits the discontent over the 1990s and the desire to reestablish Russia and what Russia lost, the sense of greatness. United Russia is the party he has put together. The idea of Velika Rossiya, great Russia, that disappeared with the hammer and sickle flag in 1991, is a powerful thing. There's still a great wounded pride in Russia, an enormous insecurity in the world today, the idea that they've been left behind. And he taps into that. So he is not an unpopular figure ruling over a population that doesn't want him. I think that's true. As for these orange revolutions, the rose revolutions, I don't see any prospect of those kind of revolutions happening in Russia because I don't think there is a popular desire for them at the moment. In Georgia and in Ukraine, but particularly Georgia, there was a broad consensus in society that it was time to change regimes. And in Georgia, you could argue that it has brought good change. Ukraine was more divided. Ukraine, I think, was closer to a 50-50 deal, where you have the West and the East, and they're very divided. And so, what you see then in the government that has emerged from that revolution is a divided government that reflects a country that hasn't figured out which way it wants to go. And it also reflects a very indecisive leader of that revolution, Yushchenko, Viktor Yushchenko, who. My wife and I covered Ukraine before the Orange Revolution. We met Yushchenko many times. We interviewed him, and we always thought, well, this guy will never, become president of Ukraine because he's such a Hamlet figure. He was such a, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. I'm not really sure. Maybe I should. Maybe I should. He never seemed like a decisive figure. He became decisive in this one great moment. When people were in the streets and needed and wanted him to be decisive. But as soon as he became president, he reverted to, the leadership style he had before, which has allowed crisis after crisis to come up and in some ways disillusion many people about the revolution that put him in power. Let's have some other questions.
You spoke a little bit about the development of the middle class and the drastic growth of the economy. Do you foresee that growth of the middle class and of the economy leading to any sort of change, if not in form of a specific revolution, but in terms of more of a grassroots or something along those lines, now that you have not necessarily only the elite being able to travel outside of the state and get more points of view and kind of escape from that?
That's the theory, right, is that as we get a bourgeois class, a class that has something worth defending, that they would want to transform their society in other ways as well. And that may be, I hope so, in some ways. But what we saw was a disconnect from politics. The more of a middle class that emerged, the more they didn't want to have anything to do with politics. They wanted to build a life. They wanted to, they wanted to have something to show for everything they had gone through. And so the idea of participating in politics never seemed very appealing to them. My wife went and spent a year in a high school class. Not the whole year. She dropped in every once in a while, every few weeks, to kind of catch up on what they were doing. It was a history class. And the idea was to explore this thesis that the next generation, your generation in Russia, would replace the old apparatchik generation and bring in these new ideals. And it was really just a matter of time. And eventually, when the new generation really took hold in Russia, that's when we would see, the genuine change we all have hoped for. And so she went there to see that happen. And she thought she'd see, an old Soviet teacher, trying to beat the kids into submission, and they would be, no, we want to be like the rest of the world. It really was the opposite. On the very first day she was there, they were talking about the Russian Revolution, and they took a poll. Who was right? Whose side would you be on? And most of them voted for the Reds. One of them said Lenin was right. We wanted to, Lenin was right. And the contrast was stark, because in fact they didn't actually know what Lenin was about. And by contrast, the teacher was a Democrat, small d. She was trying to get them to see the value of an open democratic society and how wrong the Bolsheviks were. But she was fighting against the kids who didn't actually live in that system, but only heard romanticized versions of it from their parents. These were the kids, by the way. The girls were all reading Russian Cosmo. The boys, were all planning to go to management school, business school. They all had their cell phones. I mean, they were enjoying the trappings of a modern, un-Soviet lifestyle. And they didn't understand the Soviet lifestyle that they said that they were nostalgic for. So it's this very very complicated situation where, how does that translate 10 years from now when these kids are running the country? Where do they take us from there? And the lesson from that high school class that my wife got out of that is that we can't say for sure. It's not a very clear picture.
Thank you.
A couple questions. Could you talk a little bit about the Second Chechen War, how it was operated and stuff like that? I guess the extent of it, and also how do you see Russia's relationship with Iran and the nuclear thing? So,
On the Chechnya, what is specifically? I'm sorry. What?
Just the extent of the war. What did it all? How was it operated? The book by the. Putin's Russia, the lady who was killed.
Polkovskaya, yeah.
Yes. She talks a little bit about the conditions, if you could just expand on that.
Sure. Russia and Chechnya have fought two wars basically since 1994. Really, it's been one long, unending war, if you arguably going back to Tsarist times. Chechens never really accepted Russian rule, never really accepted Moscow's rule. The Chechens, for those who don't know much about it, are these mountain people with a fierce pride and a fierce sense of their own identity, and have always been, sort of the bastard stepchildren in Russia to many ways of thinking about things. They're treated in the same way that African Americans have often been treated in this country. In a very the racism is broad and deep and powerful. If you want to call somebody something negative in Moscow, you call them a Chechen. People are rounded up in the streets for having dark skin, and they're called Chechens. Even if they're not Chechens, they could be Tajiks, they could be Armenians, whatever. A friend of mine who's an American Jew who had, Semitic look and curly hair and so forth, would constantly be stopped in the streets by Russian police because they thought he was Chechen. He'd show him his, U.S. passport, and they'd be shocked. So the Second War, which began when Putin came to power as prime minister and then later as president, really just devastated the place. I didn't cover a lot of it, but I went several times in the latter part of my time there, and the country was just laid to waste. Grozny, the capital, suffered more munitions, more bomb power on it than any city in Europe since World War II. I mean, just leveled. There was you could not drive through Grozny and find a building that was not partially destroyed, that was not partially rubble. And the civilian population was brutalized by both sides. I mean, the Chechen rebels are not freedom fighters. Some of them might be, but Anna Polkovskaya, I think, to some extent, there's a criticism that she over-romanticizes the Chechen rebels, and that may be a fair critique, but her point is that the state has an obligation that radical guerrillas don't, take upon themselves, which is to act in a civilized way of some sort. And the Russian soldiers were every bit as vicious and brutal as the terrorists in some ways that they were fighting in terms of the civilians. It's a no man's land of lawlessness and deep and dark shadows that you can't quite penetrate. Both sides doing business with each other, and selling munitions back and forth, selling hostages back and forth. People, you could get knocks on the door at night and they come and take men away, and then you wouldn't see them for a long time. By the time we left, they started doing that with women, because there were these shahidkas, women suicide bombers, who had become a prevalent problem late in our tour there. It's only now beginning to stabilize. I don't want to say normalize, which is the phrase a lot of people use. There's not big battles anymore. They're not, what we think of as a war in that sense. The Russians have killed off most of the main leaders of the Chechen movement, and that seems to have undercut the remaining guerrilla forces. They're still there. They still do stage attacks from time to time. It's still very dangerous. It's more about lawlessness now than it is about a direct war. And part of that is because what Putin has done is he's co-opted the Chechen rebels. In effect, he took some and said, "You come work for me. You be my bitch, and you can have power." And so they did. Akhmat Kadyrov, who was the handpicked administrator of Chechnya, was a former rebel. And they said, no, you're in charge now. You're our guy in Moscow. Do whatever you want, by the way. Steal anything you want. Brutalize the population, anything you want. His son Ramzan, who now is in charge, runs this, Kadyrovtsi, this sort of militia, in effect, of almost all former rebels who just basically do the same thing that they did when they were on the other side, running roughshod through the population, committing atrocities, kidnapping people for money, doing whatever they want. And that's what Anna Politkovskaya was investigating when she was killed. Atrocities committed by Ramzan Kadyrov, the former rebel who had basically been co-opted by Moscow. So, it's still a terrible situation down there.
What can you say about the crackdown on democratic thought and so on, as far as academic freedoms are concerned in the Russian Federation?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. And I forgot your Iran question, so I'll come back to that in a second. My wife wrote a story, which is, I think, included in the book, about how they took a high school textbook and edited it. And she managed to get a copy of the original and saw all the black marks and all of the comments, and we can't have this and we can't have that. And suddenly you had a situation, if you go through what they did with this textbook, which they minimized the crimes of the Soviet era, minimized any criticism of Putin, or got rid of it altogether, and you feel like it's returning to some of the old ways in that sense. That's the secondary school level. But even on the collegiate level, the university level, a friend of ours is a Byzantine scholar at a university there, and even there he says, they're now suddenly afraid of contacts with foreigners because it will be seen as somehow, spying. They've taken a number of academics who had contacts with the West and charged them with espionage, and in some cases put them in jail for a long time on very, very questionable charges. There's still the attitude there that contact with the West in the academic setting constitutes giving away something. That you're somehow not loyal to your country if you're, working with the British or the French or the Americans. And so that a chill has, and I don't know this from Putin necessarily, but the people that he has empowered have sort of returned to some of those old ways of thinking about things and have created a chill in the academic environment in which people, may not be told to do this or that, or may not be censored, or may not be ordered, but they recognize what they have to do to stay safe and to, avoid any problems. And it's sort of, it's a disturbing trend on a lot of levels. On Iran, the relationship with Iran is complicated. It's changed, I think, substantially during the Yeltsin era and in the early Putin era. When the United States criticized them for building the nuclear plant at Bushehr, the Russians basically said, take a hike. Screw you. They're giving us $800 million. We're going to build them a plant. There was a moment when the Iranian opposition came forward with proof that, or at least evidence that, Iran was secretly trying to build nuclear weapons, that the Russians were shocked, I think genuinely hadn't believed anybody until that point. And their attitude toward Iran changed. They actually began to believe that there was an issue, that there was a threat of an Iran building a nuclear weapon. It hasn't meant that they've jumped on board with U.S. view of how to approach that. They still believe in working with Iran more than Bush and the administration does. But they've been much more cooperative on the broad principle of putting pressure on Tehran to give up its nuclear program than they had been prior to 2003 or whenever that was. So, what the administration officials would tell you is, the Russians are still a pain in the ass when it comes to Iran, but at least now they're our pain in the ass. I don't know if that helps for sure.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you mentioned towards the beginning of your talk how these sort of non-coercive means of the government consolidating power in terms of, like, the first thing they took over was was TV. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of popular culture and the entertainment industry in general. I don't know too much about Russian cinema, but my background is in German, and they have kind of a similar post-Cold War phenomenon of nostalgia, which they call Ostalgie, like
Right.
Eastern nostalgia for East Germany. And you see that a lot in the cinema genres that you see in the 1990s. So
Right.
wonder
Well,
if
look,
you have any
we're
experience with that.
nostalgic for the 70s, so obviously everybody has, everybody has poor memories. But in Russian culture, you see it a lot. When in the 90s arrived, everything Western was cool. They wanted to watch Western movies, they wanted Western television, they wanted Western culture, Western music. By the time Putin came into power, there was this hunger for something Russian again. And that's not unhealthy, by the way. That's a good thing. They wanted something of their own. They wanted something called Nasha. Nasha means ours. Nasha became a very powerful force in the last 6-7 years in Russia. It's always been a powerful force, actually, but it's really renewed itself. And there's a great chapter in there about this radio station guy. He'd come to America, gotten to learn the radio business in Los Angeles, loved American rock music and British rock music and so forth, but got home and decided that there was this hunger for Russian music again, Russian rock music again. So he started a new radio station. He called it Nasha, and he promoted Russian rock. And polls showed that people didn't want to listen to American music anymore. They wanted to listen to their own. But then what happened is it became sort of infused with some of the nationalism that was coming up, and that became ultranationalism. There were songs then that were like, very anti-minority, anti-West, that pride in Russia became equivalent to this sort of fierce strain of nativism and nationalism. And that's sort of taken over. In fact, in this very radio station founder that we talked to, by the end of the chapter, you'll see, and by the end of the experiment, in fact, has come to regret having done it, because he feels like he tapped into this force that became more powerful than he could control. And so that's something that Russia struggles with today, the difference between pride in your country and a more dangerous, nationalism. It's true on other fronts as well. Their movie industry is back, which is a good thing. They're now creating blockbuster movies that didn't exist for years and years. But many of the movies that are popular these days are a little chilling if you think about them, because when we got there, the movie Brat 2 was the most popular movie. Brat 2, it's a sequel to the original Brat. Brat means brother. And it was about a guy who is a veteran of Chechnya and is basically a brutal thug who comes to Chicago and guns down Americans and rescues a poor Russian woman who's been brutalized by the mean, nasty people of Chicago. And he is a hero for this it's a very violent movie. It's like some of our more, like a Quentin Tarantino kind of movie. And the message is very chilling if you think about it. And the soundtrack from that became the most popular thing in Russia for a while. And it was a great soundtrack. So, there's this sort of two-edged sword there as they try to reestablish an identity and create a cultural identity. KGB movies are now popular again. Things that, romanticize some of the exploits of the old days, tapping into that sort of popular nostalgia. Nostalgia is a popular restaurant, in fact. So, it's a real interesting dichotomy and an interesting situation in which the culture reflects this same political trend that we're talking about.
And just a quick follow-up, is there governmental control, like, in the movie industry? I mean, do they have a hand in...
No, I mean, but having said that, when some people wanted to have a Chechen Film Festival in Moscow, they pretty much put a stop to that. So it's not, it may not be direct, but people understand what the boundaries are.
I was wondering if you could talk about at all how the Putin administration sees freedom of religion and those freedoms that we have here in terms of worship, whether it be Judaism, Islam, Christianity.
Right. Russian law recognizes 3 religions. There are 3 official state religions in Russia: Orthodox Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And those are the most popular, those are the most common religions in Russia. The other ones have to go, if you want to be something else, any other faith has an enormous bureaucratic rigmarole it has to go through to register and operate in Russia. The Seventh-day Adventists have had, enormous problems there. The Baptists have had enormous problems there. The Catholics have had enormous problems there. So religion has returned in Russia in a very powerful way since the end of the Soviet Union. Arguably, it was never really gone, even though the state was officially atheist. Most people were still, felt that they were Orthodox Christian, one way or the other. They were believers. But it still remains under, a very tight state control. Look what happened in the Jewish faith in Russia. There's a chief rabbi of Russia. Well, Putin installed his own chief rabbi in Russia because they didn't like the other one. So now today there are two chief rabbis in Russia. There's the officially sanctioned one, and then there's the other guy who has to fight for legitimacy with the Putin chief rabbi. So like everything, religion falls into the same sphere of control and influence, basically.
I was wondering, you talked about how in the early 90s there was the hunger for everything West amongst the people, and now you have this nostalgia for the old Russia kind of stuff. Along with that, did there come any rejection of the U.S.? What's the public and governmental sentiment towards the U.S. people, the U.S. government? Vladimir Putin came to the U.S. and President Bush called him a friend, said he looked him in the eye, he's a good person. How do the people of Russia view the West now that they're having the kind of old KGB movements, movies kind of mentality going?
Well, that's a very good question. They like you and me. We're okay, but they don't like America as a concept, many of them. When we were there for 4 years, I can't remember. I'm trying to remember. I very little, exposure to anything that was hostile to me as an American or to my wife as an American. There was one time early on, we were in a bar, or in a restaurant, a Cuban restaurant, having dinner with some friends, Russian friends, and there was a drunk guy. He came up to us and he started, picking at, you want to go outside and fight? You want to go outside and fight? No, really, no. Okay, that kind of happens in any bar. And then I realized I'm sitting, he's standing, very big guy. I look at him and I realize at his waist is a gun on his belt. I'm like, this isn't good. And it turns out he is an FSB officer. That's the current KGB. And he's drunk and he starts, ranting about George Bush. And, fuck George Bush. He's, something George, expletive George Bush, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, guys, whatever. I mean, listen, it's not us. You want to have a conversation with him, here's his address. But, but it really scared my one of my Russian friends who was having dinner with us because she loves America and Americans, and it really disturbed her to find that sort of response. Now, again, most of it's directed at the country or the administration or the policies or at their own loss of superpower status. There's a resentment because America throws its weight around. There's a resentment at the unipolar world, which is the idea that America is the only one that gets to decide what happens anymore. And Russians miss the idea that they were as powerful and as important as America was and still is today. So, that's a very powerful strain in Russia today. There is an anti-Americanism in that sense. Having said that, it's less powerful in some ways than in Western Europe. If you were to look at polls, you'll find more Russians would say they think George Bush is okay than say so in France or in England. So, it's a complicated situation, and I don't think it's directed at you and me, but I think there is a sense of hey, we're here too. Don't think you can just push us around, and we want to have, respect. And that's why the UN still remains a very important venue for them, because the one place they have a veto, as if, it was still the old days. So we got a whole line of people.
I asked to a budget line because that my question kind of has segues into this, what you were talking about. But can you give us kind of a brief history of the relationship between the Bush administration and Putin, and especially now that Condoleezza Rice seems to have at least one ear of the Bush administration, and also how does that affect Iraq?
Good questions. One last thing I forgot to say, coming back to your point real quickly, is there is a resentment against Americans for having screwed up in the 90s. They blame us for having screwed up shock therapy and the economic reforms and having wanted to come there and just experiment on them as if they were guinea pigs. And, they have some basis for that. There were a lot of, Jeffrey Sachs and his crowd from Harvard who went there and said, let's do this, let's do that, and they were practicing macroeconomic policy, but on very real people who suffered as a result. So it's not surprising that they resented what they feel like we brought to them in the 1990s in that sense. And one other point, remember, you're talking about freedom of religion, and I'm going to come to the question in a second, but these things come to me late. In terms of freedom of religion, talking about Judaism, there's a powerful thing happening in terms of Judaism in Russia today. Russia is one of the most anti-Semitic states in the history of the world, obviously. It's the land that gave us pogroms. But today you find more Jews moving from Israel to Russia than the other way around. And so there is a new openness to religion if you're one of the three established religions. And, Jews are actually moving home, not because they want to practice their faith there, but because they view it as economically better than Israel right now. But they believe that they can go home and be safe and have some freedom to practice their faith as they want to. So it has changed in that regard. I wanted to come back to that. Bush and Putin. Bush met Putin in June 2001. That's when he looked into his soul and found a partner he could respect and admire. A lot of that comes to religion too, actually. Merges all three of these last questions together. Putin told Bush at this original meeting about the story of his cross. Now, Putin has said that his mother baptized him secretly in communist days when he was a kid, so that he is a baptized Orthodox Christian, and that his mother gave him a cross that he values very, very much. And that Putin told Bush the story when they met for the first time of how his dacha burned down. And the one thing that emerged from the dacha, from the fireman's hand as he gives it back to Putin, is the cross. Now, okay. What are we to make of this story? First of all, if the cross meant so much to him, why didn't he bring it with him to Slovenia? He didn't have it with him. He brought it to the next meeting he had with Bush. Said, by the way, here's the cross I told you about. He didn't actually carry it with him. He didn't wear it. His commitment to religion is arguable at best. What that meeting, I think, showed us was his commitment or his experience in the KGB. What are you trained to do if you are a KGB officer living in a foreign country? You manage agents. You manage contacts. You make contacts. You figure out how to appeal to the thing that matters to the person that you're managing, right? What matters to President Bush? Putin decided religion mattered to him, and it does, and decided, I think, that one way to appeal to Bush was to communicate with him on a level that he thought Bush would appreciate. And Bush did. I think that influenced Bush's view of Putin. Here is a fellow believer. Here is somebody of faith. Here is somebody who believed so much in his God that this cross was so important to him that he wanted to see it after the fire. Now, I don't want to be too cynical because maybe this is all very true, but it's hard not to think of, if you're a KGB officer, this is what you do. This is what you do. You run an agent. You appeal to people on the basis of what is important to them to get them to sympathize with you and do things you want to do. Now, Bush does not currently have the same view of President Putin. Bush has realized he made a mistake. He won't say so publicly. He'll never say that out loud. But he understands that. He understands that Putin is not the guy he thought he was. But he doesn't know what to do about it. Here's the problem. Bush thinks that if he remains friends with Putin, if he stays close with him, if he gives him friendly advice but doesn't push him too much, that is likelier to anchor him or try to anchor him in the West than to have an out-and-out lecturing, confrontational relationship with him. He may be right. I don't know. It's not for me to say. It's a very difficult situation to deal with. and the other thing to remember is that Bush has so many other things to deal with on his plate overseas in terms of Iraq, Iran, North Korea, the Middle East, that the idea of rupturing the friendship over democracy or the other things that we're concerned about, they just don't have enough time to do that. They don't have enough energy, and it's just too counterproductive. They need Russia on Iran and North Korea and Iraq. Now, I think there was a possibility that Putin would have gone along with the Iraq war, actually. But Putin was wooed very strongly by Schroeder and Chirac, particularly Chirac. Chirac had, we have a scene, I think there's in the book, Chirac has Putin come to Paris in the midst of the pre-war run-up and showers him with attention. The Champs-Élysées is lined with Russian flags, and he's the toast of the town and so forth. And Putin, at that point, starts to take a much harder line about Iraq. And then becomes part of the what becomes called the Non-Nine Niet coalition. But you'll notice that after that, Condi Rice offered a formula of her own. Let's see, ignore France, punish Germany, forgive Russia. Because they perceived Russia and Putin as simply going along with the other two, and that the real bad guys, in their view, were Schroeder in particular and Chirac. It's not a surprise, ultimately, that they would have opposed the Iraq War, if you really think about it, because they had great economic interests in Iraq at the time. Their people were in and out of Iraq all the time, building the oil infrastructure, tapping the fields. They were ready to go. The second sanctions were ever lifted, they would have made billions and billions of dollars off the Kurna field and other fields. So to them, essentially handing over Iraq to America is handing over this great big economic jewel. And Putin tried to stop the war. He tried secretly to send an envoy to Saddam Hussein saying, get out, leave now, and there won't be a war. And Saddam basically said, screw you, I'm not going to go. So what we're left with today is sort of a tense relationship where the illusions are gone. There was a moment after 9/11 when it looked like a new, post-terrorism alliance. I remember going to the U.S. Embassy after the 9/11 attacks, and there were flowers everywhere, an extraordinary outpouring. I mean, people we didn't know were sending us faxes of sympathy, and the extraordinary outpouring, and there was this bouquet of roses and the message, we were together at Elbe, we'll be together again. And there was such a moment of hope, and Putin really, he's the first foreign leader to call Bush after 9/11. You know that? He was the first one to call him, and he got on Russian television and says, we are with you, America. And it was a very powerful moment, something that really affected a lot of people. And he allowed the Americans to go to Central Asia with their military and to go to Georgia with their military. That's an extraordinary thing. That's like saying, okay, Russia, you go ahead and feel free to send troops to Mexico or to Cuba or Canada. And it's even more than that, because Central Asia was really part of their country. And they said, fine, go in. Now, it was also in their self-interest. They were enemies of the Taliban. They loved the fact that the Americans came in and finally got rid of them, which they had not been able to do. But that was an extraordinary moment when there was a possibility of genuine change. And that's all gone now. I think it's all been wiped away. So, we got a line up here. I've got to give faster answers.
I've kind of had to alter some of my questions because they've all been so good so far. But
great questions.
But you've talked a lot about Putin and his leadership style, how he's able to kind of charm some of the other leaders. And I was wondering, in your interviews with him, have you kind of gotten to know Putin? Because, I mean, in a lot of movies and whatnot, it's always been portrayed that Soviet leaders and other just Russian figureheads have always been the bad guys. They're always the evil ones. They're always crafty and trying to outwit us. But, I mean, have you gotten to know, like, his personality or kind of who he really is? And is it true that, like, I mean, I don't think it's completely true, but is the images that we always portray it, just simply propaganda to win support that we are superior to the Russians?
I can't say that I know him very well. I've had several interviews with him, and they are long interviews. When Putin does an interview, clear your schedule for the day. You have to go to the Kremlin and sit there and wait for usually about 4 hours. And then when he comes in, he'll sit there and talk for about 4 hours. So it's like an 8-hour day. It's like Fidel Castro at his peak. He was talking. And, reporters always want people to give him interviews, but at a certain point you're sitting there thinking to yourself, please stop. Please stop. But he's an engaging talker. He's very well versed. He knows his brief. You can't trip him up on a question. He's going to know the answer. He knows details. I never found him charming. I don't get this charming thing that some people feel like. To Russians, he's charming, you have to understand, partly by comparison. There's a poll once that asked him, what's the quality you admire most in Putin? And more than 40% of the Russians answered said he's sober. So, Yeltsin was charming. We could use less charming, they like Putin because he seems sober, solid, responsible, reliable. And he may come across as a little cold, a little, reserved to us, but in the Russian mind, that's a good thing. The one time you could get him angry in an interview is to talk about Chechnya. If you ask him a Chechnya question, that gets his back up. He gets all mad. Otherwise, he's very unflappable and smart. I don't think Russians is evil. I think that's sort of obviously it's a Hollywood thing. They're a convenient villain for Hollywood. I think he's responding to his country, and he is leading his country in a way that he feels that they want to go. And on some level, he's right. You know what I mean? There's not. Many Russians are unhappy about what's happening in their country in terms of democracy and things like that. But many aren't. Many are very, content. Even if they don't love Putin, they accept. And so, he is a leader, I think, who reflects his times. And, I think that's true for many countries in many eras. In some ways, the leaders tend to kind of reflect the moment that a country is in. I think he does at this moment. I don't know if that really answered the question.
You mentioned earlier about the election in 2008, and here there will be an election in 2008 as well, and there's already lots of talk about that so early in the election process. I was wondering if you could touch on what would happen if he did ratify the Constitution and Putin would have a third term. What would happen with that in relation to potential candidates that would be elected here as president, and what the U.S.-Russian relationship would look like after 2008?
Good questions. He said repeatedly he won't change the Constitution, but he also said repeatedly he wouldn't cancel the election of governors. So I think you have to take it, in that context. It would not. The theory goes among some people who are smarter than I am about Russia is that it would not be hard to seize on an event to say this is a crisis for our country. How can we lose Putin at this time? We have to, in the interest of the country, keep him there. Blah blah blah. And nationalism is seen as, in fact, the likely pretext for that sort of thing. The rise of nationalism, some sort of threat from nationalists. If he stayed, I think that would be a big problem. I think that would be the reason he doesn't stay, or if he doesn't stay, one reason would be that he perceives that as being a red line with the West. That he's gotten away with an awful lot with a minimal amount of protest and consequence in the West, but that if he literally changed the Constitution to stay in power, that it would be impossible for the West to ignore it and to simply pretend that that's just democracy Russian style. Now, he may decide to cross that red line, and it may in fact not be a red line for the West. They've said before, well, okay, he's done this, but he hasn't done that, and then he does that. And they, say, okay, well, we're not happy about it, but what can we do? If he were to do that, and the reason why that's important is Russia doesn't have a history of people giving up power voluntarily. It's really pretty much unheard of. Boris Yeltsin did, arguably. He gave up power voluntarily, but pretty much, you'd have to go back to I'm not sure too many other examples. Russian leaders die, are killed, are, sent off to exile. They don't give up power voluntarily. And so this is a real test. Does he give up power voluntarily? If he does give up power voluntarily, is he really giving up power? Or does he just give up the office? There are ways of being in power without being in office. And people speculate on how he might do that. It may also be that he's tired of it. People speculate that he seems tired and may want to just go off and just become rich or richer. Some people suspect he might want to become head of Gazprom, which is the monstrous natural energy monopoly. And if he were suddenly chairman of Gazprom, he would be an instant overnight billionaire. He probably is already a billionaire, but we don't know for sure. So 2008 looms as a huge question. What would happen in America if he were to do that? I think it would insert it into the race in a way that it's not right now and probably won't be very much. Who lost Russia? What do we do about Russia? McCain has been very outspoken about this. He has called for Russia being thrown out of the G8 because the G8 is supposed to be a club of industrial democracies, and Russia's really neither. Its economy is proportionately smaller than, Holland's. As for democracy, we've discussed that a lot today. So, he's got a very outspoken position on it. Most of the other candidates do not. John Edwards did co-chair a task force on Russia that made some strong recommendations last year, so he's addressed this. But I don't suspect it will be an issue unless what you suggest happens, in which case I think it would be a matter of some debate.
Hi, I have a question about Russian politics. Everybody's talking about, centralizing control of Russian government, which I always thought was kind of crazy because Russian government is really complicated. There's like 7 or 8 dozen federal districts, different levels of autonomy and such. And the big action recently was the end of independent election of governors, if I'm getting that right. How much control, I guess, does the Kremlin want to have over all these different provinces and localities? Is it enough to just install a governor who toes the party line and makes sure the local legislature doesn't, pass any anti-Putin measures, or is it more than that? Are they looking to micromanage the local governments and hence the local economies?
Right. Well, they actually, I don't want to say this defense, but in explanation of the elimination of governor elections, part of the context is that some of these governors, in fact, had become quite balky about central power. They were, in fact, in some cases, passing laws that were totally opposite of federal law and ignoring federal law in their districts. And they were, in many cases, bought by local oligarchs and corrupt and, creating their own fiefdoms. So I don't want to, when we talk about this, I don't want to pretend that somehow, that these were great, democratic leaders who've been, but the concept, though, obviously, of eliminating the election of them, the reason why it was given to do it, for instance, was because of Beslan. Remember, Beslan was when the Chechen terrorists take over school and slaughter all these school children. It was a horrific event. I was there, and I've never seen, and I hope never to see again, anything so horrible. And immediately afterwards, he said, okay, we're getting rid of the election of governors from 89 provinces, all the way to Kamchatka, all the way to, Sakhalin, and all the way to, Chukotka in the far, far east. Thousands and thousands of miles, 10 time zones away from Chechnya and any, radical Islamic terrorists. So it was an excuse. It was something that they've been thinking about doing for a while. I don't think they want to micromanage each territory, but they don't want them to challenge them either. They want to eliminate anybody who might, stand up to them and do anything that they don't want. The first thing he did when he came in was create these 7 super governors, they called them, polpreds, to oversee the different territories and act as sort of like governor generals of the old Tsarist era. It's impossible to micromanage Russia. You're right about that. It's a country of vast proportions, 11 time zones. Think about that, 11 time zones. It's literally, even today, with all the territory they've lost, it's still something like 1/7 of the world's landmass. So it is, in fact, an ungovernable place. And the argument that many people make who are sympathetic to Putin, and it's not a bad argument, is that you need strong central power in such, a vast, ungovernable place. And I think there's some argument to be made there. But you have to look at the context in which all of these things have happened to recognize that it's not just about making a ungovernable state governable. It is about the Kremlin being in charge.
Some of my question was already answered a bit, but I just wanted you to elaborate, if you could, on the status with China and that long border they have on the east.
Great question.
Just what do you think just what are your thoughts on that? I just leave it open-ended. And also, I read that you stayed in the northern Afghanistan region for some time. Do you want to share a bit about your experiences there?
Okay.
And did you get to meet their leader, the Northern Alliance? I forget his, who died.
No, unfortunately, he was killed 2 days before 9/11, and it's sort of a precursor to 9/11. But I'll come back to that. I'll do.
All right.
China is a great question. China obviously has a huge, monstrous border with Russia, and if you go to the Far East today, you can understand why Russia is paranoid about it. Russia has this vast land we just talked about in the Far East with only a handful of people by comparison to China to their south, which is bursting at the seams. So they're extraordinarily paranoid that the Chinese are going to come over the border one day and just take over all of Siberia. That sounds fanciful, right? But if you think about it, in the provinces that are right on China's border, I don't hold me the numbers. I think they're like something like, I've forgotten, but 15 million people or something like that on the Russia side, and something like 100 million people on the borders on the China side. So they're paranoid about it, and they're racist about the Chinese who come over the border to work and to sell in the trading markets. But there's a serious demographic issue there. I mean, China, and the contrast between the success of the Chinese economy compared to what's happened on the other side of the border, where Russians in that part of Russia are still living pretty, hand to mouth, is extraordinary. The Russians look down the south and they're jealous and they're upset. How come we're not like that? They have these monstrously big, beautiful, shiny new cities, and we still have, we're still living in hovels, and so it's a great source of resentment. Having said that, there is a symbiotic relationship between the two. China right now is the fastest growing energy consumer in the world. Russia is the largest energy producer in the world. Russia today pumps almost as much oil every day as Saudi Arabia, and has more natural gas than anybody in the world. So, China wants, and Putin is agreeing to build a pipeline to China to sell some of that oil to China. So their relationship is going to become more important and more fused with the economic ties that they're building. So watching that relationship is very important to the United States, and very important, I think, for the rest of the world to pay attention to. Now, let's see. Afghanistan. I did go into Afghanistan. Right after 9/11, everybody wanted to go to Afghanistan, obviously, because that's where Osama was, and that's where the story was going to be. Historically, reporters have gotten into Afghanistan by going through Pakistan. So, and Pakistan was not part of my territory. But I decided to go down to Central Asia because there had been Islamic terrorism in some of those states, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so forth, over the years, and thought it would be good to go root around to see what I could find out. And within a few days, it suddenly became their base north of Kabul. And I basically spent the better part of the next 8 months in and out of Afghanistan covering the war. I was there before the American CIA and Special Forces arrived. I was there the night the bombing started. I watched it from the tower at Bagram, which at that time, Bagram Air Base north of Kabul, which at the time all the windows had blown out. There's minefields everywhere, and we just spent the night, a very cold night with the wind gusting through the open aircraft tower, watching the bombs fall on the Taliban. And you can see these lines of Taliban pickup trucks and their headlights trying to flee the city. And it's an extraordinary place, Afghanistan, very rich in history and culture, and the people are extraordinary. And for me, it was a great reporting experience. I think that's where I really learned how to be a foreign correspondent. And they had a real history with Russia, obviously, so there was a real connection to my interest and responsibility of covering Russia. In fact, I couldn't find an English speaker as a translator at first, so I found an Afghan who spoke Russian. He would translate from Dari to Russian, and I would have to figure out the Russian translation into English, but it made my Russian a little bit better. But an extraordinary place. It's still an extraordinary place. It's not completely, obviously there's still a lot of Taliban there, and it's not completely settled which direction I think it's going to go.
What are the practical applications of all this? Like, what should America be doing? And basically, what is the whole point?
It's not for me to say what America should do. I don't, I'm a reporter. I don't give policy advice. The thing that was important to me is that America simply understand. I think that after the 90s, we all sort of decided, okay, Soviet Union's gone, everything's fine. Russia's, it's becoming a democracy, and we can pay attention to other parts of the world. What I think is important is that we pay attention to Russia as well, and that we not pretend that everything is fine, and that we not pretend that there aren't important issues there that are of importance to the United States as well. We talk a lot about bringing democracy to the world, and we're focused right now on Iraq, and we see how difficult it is there. Well, Russia shows how difficult it is, even in a place, that in theory wanted to adopt a new way and to recreate a society. These are not easy transformations that countries go through. And the main point that I would have is just that we ought to be fully aware of that. We ought to recognize it. We ought to pay attention and be honest about, the things that are happening in places like Russia. Because if we don't own up to it, if we don't pay attention and really look it in the eye, we're never going to figure out the right course. So I hope that answers that a little bit. I guess you have one question? We'll take one last question and then.
Yeah. So you said Putin, laments the fall of the Soviet Union. Does he? How often does he invoke that imagery or the specific personalities of leaders? Is it? Yeah, that's it.
He does it frequently. I mean, not as blatantly or brazenly, perhaps, as that. But he had. They changed, for instance, the outside of Red Square. There's a memorial to World War II dead, and there are a series of granite blocks, or what we call, but anyway, they list the cities they call hero cities that underwent such trauma during World War II, and one of them was Volgograd. That was Stalingrad, and they renamed it under Putin. They put Stalin back there, Stalingrad, and changed the name back. Not of the city, of the memorial. And that was seen as a sign, basically. That was the first time Stalin's name had been restored to something, in decades, actually. And so he does small things like that. He reintroduced the Soviet anthem as the new national anthem. Without the words, they got rid of the words. But he understood that the music still had powerful resonance to Russians who grew up with that, melody, whatever the right word is. So he plays to that feeling in subtle and not so subtle ways pretty regularly. Thanks, guys. Thank you.
And I'm Mark Witherspoon, a member of the First Amendment Day Committee, and we held off giving this to him because if he wasn't very good, we weren't going to give it to him. But I think he'll agree that he was a marvelous speaker and deserved the award of Champion of the First Amendment. If you want to, there's refreshments over here, and where are you going to be? Over here signing books.
Thank you all. Thank you for a great evening.